Hi, my name is David Coffin. I'm the author of the book Shirtmaking, the companion to this video. I want to show you the special sewing techniques I use to make classic dress shirts and other shirt-like garments, including blouses, sports shirts, work shirts, shirt jackets. These garments often have typical shirt details like rolled hems, flat-felled seams, plackets, cuffs, and collars. And the techniques for making these details are what we'll be looking for in this video. These skills are not hard, they just take some practice. But once you're comfortable with them, you'll find that you can plug in these techniques when you're making any shirt or shirt-like garment and significantly improve your results. I'll be suggesting throughout the video that you make samples with each of the techniques before going on to make the real thing in a garment. To make the samples, here's what you'll need. All the sewing is done on a standard sewing machine. There are no serger techniques involved. You'll need two specialized feet for your sewing machine, a rolled hem foot and a felling foot, which you'll find useful for many other sewing projects. Your machine probably came with the hammer, and the felling foot is available for all machines. There's a mail order source listed at the end of the tape if your dealer can't help you. You'll also need about a yard of good quality, all-cotton, shirt-weight fabric. Broadcloth or Oxford cloth will be fine. You can do these techniques with other fabrics, but for the easiest and best results at this point, you'll find cotton the best choice. In any case, avoid a polycotton blend because you'll need to be able to press a sharp crease into the fabric, and polyester resists creasing. Any cotton thread will do for these samples, but a fine cotton embroidery thread, like the ones made by DMC or Mettler, is ideal for shirt-weight fabrics when you're making a real shirt. For the pattern pieces, for the sample sleeve placket, cuff, and collar, any commercial shirt pattern will give you what you need. But you'll also find patterns in my book for these same pieces, provided full size for tracing. For the other samples, we'll begin with simple rectangles of fabric. I'll give you the dimensions when we get to each section. In order that all the terms I use in this video are clear, let me review the basic parts of a typical shirt. Usually the body of the shirt has 3 parts, 2 fronts and 1 back, joined at the shoulders by a 2-layer yoke. The sleeves are one-piece sleeves, each with a sleeve placket and cuff. The side seams, underarm seams, and the Armscye seams are all flat-felled. The collar is the standard 2-part collar used in dress shirts. It has a collar stand and a collar. That's it for the parts of a typical shirt. To make a really good-looking shirt or blouse, the sewing skills I'm going to show you will be a big help. I've devised all the techniques I'll be demonstrating with the goal of making it easy to produce precise, accurate, and professional-looking results. This means that the size, shape, and position of finished details will be exactly what the pattern intends. Symmetrical details like cuffs and collar points will look identical. Stripes will match. Stitching lines will be steady and accurately follow the edges they're near, and so on. In short, these techniques will enable you to produce everything you'd expect from a top-quality, ready-to-wear garment. Learning these skills requires attention to detail, but the results are worth it. Accuracy and the smoothness of your stitching line are far more important than speed, so take your time with the samples and when you're actually sewing. If you look at a classic dress shirt, you'll find that it has a very narrow hem and narrow, precise, flat-felled side seams which continue down the underarm. There are also flat-felled seams at the Armscye, but I'll discuss those later. If we had to sew that hem and those narrow seams entirely by hand, it would be very difficult. Fortunately, there are 2 presser feet available, the ones I mentioned earlier, which you can get for any machine, which essentially do the job for us. The rolled hem foot and the flat-felled foot. These feet make matters much, much easier, and they're the same ones manufacturers use to make the same seams. Let's begin with the rolled hem. A rolled hem is simply a narrow width of fabric along one edge, folded over twice, and stitched down once parallel to the edge. The rolled hem foot makes it easy to do this with precise and consistent results. For your sample, cut a rectangle of fabric about 10 by 15 inches. The exact size doesn't matter. To make a rolled hem, start by folding over 1/8 of an inch of fabric, then iron the fold. Now fold the edge over another 1/8 of an inch and iron it again. Now position the fabric under the foot with the folded edge parallel to and just under the edge of the foot. Notice how the width of the folds equals the width of the opening in the foot. Stitch on top of the edge for 1/2 inch. Then, with a needle down, pull the folded edge up over the foot and into the little metal loop. I find a pair of tweezers helpful for getting a grip on the edge. From this point on, you merely guide the fabric into the foot, making sure to consistently feed precisely 1/4 inch of the fold into the foot, or twice the width of the foot's opening. Don't pull the fabric to the left out of the foot, or to the right underneath the foot. Both will distort the rolled hem you produce. So here's what the hem looks like when I was folding over the proper amount of fabric. Here's what it looks like when I was pulling it a bit far to the right. And here's what it looks like when I was pulling fabric out to the left. But the interesting thing to notice is that in every case we've still got a finished hem. It's just not as smooth and clean as you might like. But if you're going to tuck the hem in anyway, you might decide that this is good enough. If you've got a curved edge to hem, like the hem of a typical shirt, things get a little more exciting, but the procedure is the same. Press over the curved edge twice, just as we did for a straight hem, and position the edge under the foot, edge stitching the edge for 1/2 inch as before. With the needle down, lift the fabric fold into the foot, and in just the same way as for the straight hem, all you have to do is consistently feed 1/4 inch of fabric into the foot. As the fabric curves, you simply have to anticipate the curve so you're not caught short when the foot gets to the curve. Always keep your eye on the 3 to 4 inches in front of the foot, pivoting the fabric so you can maintain that 1/4 inch fold at the edge. It's not as difficult as it may sound. Just cut some curved scraps and practice a little, and take it slow and steady. If you wind up with minor inconsistencies like this, I suggest you just ignore them. Since tight curves are harder to do than the more gradual ones, I suggest you cut your hems out to start with easy gradual curves. When you get to the side seam as you're hemming a real shirt, like this plaid one I'll be working on throughout the video, you may not be able to get its bulk through the loop on the foot. So just stop a little short of the side seam, skip over it, and then start sewing again 1 inch or so on the other side, as if you were at the beginning of the hem. When you've finished the rest of the hem, you can come back and top stitch the hem down with a regular foot, blending into the hemming stitches, and then cut the loose threads away. Why use flat felled seams? Well, besides being good looking and requiring very little seam allowance, they're very strong and they completely finish each raw edge, so they're ideal for unlined washable garments like shirts. Here's how a flat felled seam works. First, using a special foot, the wider seam allowance on the bottom layer of fabric is folded over the narrower seam allowance on top and stitched down. Then you separate the layers and send them back through the foot so that the folded edge gets stitched down, covering the remaining raw edge. To make a sample flat felled seam, cut out 2 rectangles of fabric and start by positioning one on top of the other with the bottom layer offset by 1/8 inch. Then fold over 1 inch or 2 of the offset bottom edge and iron the folded edge. Slide the edge under the felling foot, just inside the toe of the foot, and stitch for about 1/2 inch. Then stop, needle down, and position the fold in the foot. The feller works just like the rolled hem foot, except that it folds the fabric over instead of rolling it. You only feed 1/8 inch into the feller instead of 1/4 inch as we did for the rolled hem. Notice again that the width of the fold is equal to the width of the opening in the foot. Thus, the width of the foot shows you exactly what your seam allowance needs to be. Twice the width of the opening for the wide side, and exactly the width for the narrow side. Keep the bottom fabric layer positioned consistently 1/8 inch beyond the top layer as you sew along the edge. So here's the finished first step. You'll notice that I didn't catch the folded edge completely, and I noticed that while I was sewing, so I moved the edge over, and for the rest of the seam I did catch it. But even though I missed the edge, the seam is still strong. So the next step is to open up the layers and iron the seam flat, covering the raw edge. Then position this new fold under the foot, lining up the previous line of stitching against the foot, and feed the fabric evenly so that the foot sews along this edge. The only tricky part is sewing the second row on a sleeve, because then you have to sew inside a tube of fabric. The easiest way is if you've got a free arm machine. In that case, you just sew the sleeve so that it gathers around the arm like this. Just keep the first seam against the foot and the rest of the sleeve out of the way, and it's easy. The narrower the sleeve and the shorter the placket opening at the cuff, the more awkward this will be to do, but it's still possible. If you don't have a free arm machine, turn the sleeve so that the seam is on the inside, and let the fabric gather around the needle like this. It may look awkward, but it's worth doing for the tiny professional-looking seam you'll produce. The Armscye seam, which joins the sleeve to the body, is also flat-felled, but it's too wide to do with the felling foot. But with a little care, you can do it just as precisely with the regular machine foot. Basically, the seam works like this. Instead of using a special foot to fold over the wider seam allowance, which is the one on the sleeve, you have to fold it by hand first. Then you position the narrower seam allowance on the body over the fold, offset by 1/8 of an inch, and stitch them together. Then you separate the layers, press the seams over the raw edge, and stitch again parallel to the first row. Let's make a sample. I'm starting with one rectangle of fabric that's big enough to cut the top part of my sleeve pattern. Next, I set my guide on my rotary cutter to 7/8 of an inch, which is the size of the seam allowance I want to cut at the top of the sleeve. I'm laying out the length of the Armscye in a rough curve along one edge and then cutting it out. It doesn't have to be precise. Because this is a sample, I'm going to measure the length of the Armscye so I can then cut out an accurate armhole on the second rectangle, which is about 15 by 18. The easiest way I've found to accurately fold over the sleeve cap seam allowance is to use a cardboard guide called a template. The template is the same shape as the top of the sleeve pattern plus 1/2 an inch, which is the width I want the seam allowance to be after it's folded. I position the template on top of the sleeve so that the seam line marked on the template is 7/8 of an inch away from the cut edge of the fabric. Now it's a simple matter of folding the cut edge over the template with the iron. Once you've established the fold, remove the template and press the fold again. Use the glue stick in a couple of places to hold the curved fold flat. Simply adjust the stick so that only a tiny bit sticks out, like this. Then use the edge of the applicator to spread a very thin spot. Iron the fabric over the glue spot to stick it down, and wash the garment after it's completed to remove the glue. The seam allowances on the sleeve and on the body are different. The seam allowance on the top edge of the sleeve is 7/8 of an inch folded to 1/2 an inch, as we've just done. And on the Armscye, it's 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to attach the two pieces together, starting in the center and working out towards each end by pivoting the armhole layer on top an inch or so at a time to match the curve of the sleeve cap below. Find the center of each piece by folding it in half and ironing a center crease near the top seam allowance. Position the sleeve and body pieces with wrong sides and center creases together, and the sleeve on the bottom, and pin them. So I can use the edge of my presser foot as a guide. I'm setting the needle position so that it's 3/8 of an inch from the presser foot's edge. Then I position the two layers of fabric under the foot so that the raw edge of the armhole is aligned with the edge of the presser foot, which leaves the folded edge of the sleeve cap sticking out 1/8 of an inch. If I keep this relationship consistent throughout, I'll always be stitching on the seam line of both pieces. With the layers in this position, sew 1 or 2 inches, and then with the needle down, stop and realign the two curves to get them back into position. After finishing the first side, go back to the center and sew the other side. Then press the seam open on a tailor's ham. Use the ham to iron the seam flat, pulling the sleeve and body pieces apart as you iron. To complete the seam, sew the second line of stitches just at the edge of the fold from the right side. The curve at the top is obviously the tricky part to sew, but that's what shapes the sleeve to your shoulder. Placket's a classic, nice-looking shirt detail that's typically used to create an opening at the end of a sleeve where the cuff joins it. It can also be turned around and put on the front of a shirt as a neckline opening for a pullover or tunic shirt. Because it involves some folding to make and it has this pointed end which has to be made accurately or it looks sort of sloppy, plackets are usually considered hard to make, but they're pretty easy to do once you know how. Here's a commercial placket pattern with the triangular end that I spoke of. There's actually a much easier way to make this than to cut it out like that to start with, but we'll get to that in a moment. The pattern itself may look a little odd, but this is how it folds up to create the placket you're used to seeing. We'll look at exactly how to fold it in more detail in a moment, but first let's look at the logic of the pattern. A placket has a stitching box in the center, 2 equal width sections on the left plus seam allowances, and 2 equal width but wider sections on the right plus seam allowances, with the rightmost segment being what I call the placket's tower. The left-hand sections are the same width as the stitching box, and the tower sections simply have to be wider than that. You'll notice that the top of the tower on this pattern is not triangular. That's part of the easier method I mentioned. You can design your own placket pattern to be any length or width you want, provided you keep these proportions and setup. Since all the lines are parallel, a piece of graph paper makes a sensible place to lay out your initial design. I like to use a piece of quilter's template plastic to make the final pattern because you can see through it and because it makes a nice stiff guide for the rotary cutter. To transfer the lines and marks for the pattern to the plastic, I simply score it along them with the tip of an X-Acto knife. The top part of the tower, above this line, doesn't even have to be a triangle. Here's a different looking placket with all the components of a typical placket from here to here, but above the stitching box I've reshaped the tower to serve as an elbow patch. From here down, the pattern is exactly the same as on a regular placket. You can even cut the pattern in 2 parts. This enables you to get the pieces out of smaller pieces of fabric. I simply separated the pattern along the center of the stitching box, which is the slash for the opening. On striped fabric, it's a nice touch to have the stripe of the placket match the stripe of the fabric underneath. Ready-to-wear shirts don't usually go to this length, but it's very easy to do. Here's how. Once you've designed your pattern, make a tissue paper version of it, or use your commercial placket pattern, and then fold it on its folding lines like this, so that the tower portion is covering the slash lines. Then take it over to a light source, like a window, fold it like that so that you can see the stitching line, the slash line rather, in the center of the stitching box, and simply trace off that line like that. When you're ready to cut the placket out, locate the stripe where you'll cut the slash on the sleeve. Here it's between a green and a white stripe. Then find the same part of the pattern on your placket fabric and arrange your placket pattern so that the line you just marked is sitting on the stripe you want. So now when you attach that placket to that sleeve, the stripes will match. When you work with these plackets, you need to distinguish between the right and left ones. The key is to remember that with the placket in position, the tower is always on the side nearest the center of the sleeve. Before you start stitching your placket, iron the placket folds. Start with the seam allowances, then iron all the other folds on their fold lines. Careful ironing is crucial to making not only a professional-looking placket, but also to many of the other shirt details we'll be looking at. You'll use the iron both to form and to shape these details, and once you've created a shape or an edge that's just as you want it, stitching it down accurately will be much easier. It's not critical what kind of iron you have, just how you use it. So pay particular attention in each process to the stages that require you to use your iron. As I said before, to make the point at the top of the tower, you don't actually have to begin with a triangular top. Here's the easy way to make the top. After all the vertical folds are made in the placket, fold the right corner of the tower flush with the left side of the tower and press. Then fold the left corner of the tower flush right with the right side of the tower and press. Trim the excess at the folds if you like, although most shirting fabrics won't require this. Then glue baste the folds in place. And iron again. Now let's look at how to make the placket. Stitching around the box is the first step. To mark one side of the stitching box, I'm creasing a line onto the fabric with my fingernail. The other side of the box happens to fall on a stripe, so it doesn't need marking. For this sample sleeve, I've cut out a rectangle about 10 by 20 inches. To stitch around the center stitching box, I've set my machine to 20 or 25 stitches to the inch, and I'm careful to follow the marked lines exactly. Cut open along the center line, then clip diagonally to each corner of the box, just to the stitching line. Iron back the folds at the stitching box. Turn the placket over and bring the folds to the right side. Iron the top of the box flat. But leave the seam allowances pointing towards the box. The fold line you made earlier on the underlap should cause the underlap to just cover the stitching box seam line. If it doesn't, press a new fold line so that it does. Then edge stitch along the edge from top to bottom. As the term implies, edge stitching involves stitching right along an edge. But stitch no more than 1/16 of an inch from the edge. If you're farther than that, it's top stitching. In either case, the stitches have to be beautiful, straight, and uniformly distant from the edges of the details they stitch down. So go as slowly as necessary to keep them accurate. Next, fold the tower into position, match stripes, iron it, and then glue baste it in place. Feel through the placket to find the bottom end of the stitching box and mark it with your fingernail. Now you're ready to sew around the tower. Here's what you'll do. Edge stitch around the tower till you get to just beyond the marked bottom edge. Then sew across. Down, counting stitches so you can make both plackets the same, and across. I like to make a bar tack on the opening side of this small box with a narrow buttonhole stitch. To secure the bar tack at the end, turn your stitch length dial to 0 and take a couple of lock stitches in place. On cuffs, there's usually a lot of bulk here at the ends of the cuff, where the ends attach to the placket. And it's often difficult to attach the cuff without creating a little jog or unevenness at the same place, like this. The method I use to attach cuffs solves both these problems. Instead of making the cuff as a separate unit and attaching it to the sleeve, we're going to make the cuff with the sleeve rolled up inside it. Here's how. I suggest you make a sample by attaching a cuff to a plain rectangle of fabric, about 8 inches wide. Perhaps you can use the other end of your placket sample, as I'm doing here. Make a rolled hem along the long edges of the rectangle, like this, so they'll be similar to the placket edges you'd be working on the real thing. If you don't have a simple cuff pattern on hand, cut a couple of rectangles about 3.5 inches deep and wide enough to stick out 1/4 inch on each side of the sample rectangle. Shape the edges if you want to. The cuff is made up of a top cuff and an under cuff, which gets sewn together over the bottom edge of the sleeve. To make a cuff, first position the bottom of one of the cuff pieces along the sleeve edge. This would be the top cuff on the real thing. And with right sides together, stitch from the sleeve side using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Start exactly at one sleeve edge and stop at the other one, being careful not to stitch beyond these points. We'll use these end points as markers, so be precise. Leave the thread ends unclipped. Turn the cuff back, place the second cuff on top of the first with right sides together, and sew across the top edge, leaving the ends of the cuff and any shaping unstitched. Open the cuff layers out flat and fold back the shirt sleeve. Then, starting exactly at the ends of the cuff sleeve seam, iron a sharp diagonal crease on either side to get the sleeve out of the way when you sew. Pin the two sleeve folds in place with the sleeve folded back so it can be enclosed between the two cuff layers. Carefully match the cuff ends and start sewing about 1.5 inches from the corner, exactly on top of the sleeve cuff seam. Hold out the threads at the corner so you can see exactly where to pivot. Stitch around the end and up to the seam that joins the two cuff layers. Then do the other side the same way. Trim and clip the corners, but grade the seam allowances at the sleeve cuff seam. Then press open the seam allowances. Remove the pins inside, and with the point turner, turn the base corners of the cuff. Lightly tugging to get each corner shaped nicely. And wiggle the end seams to get it all turned out evenly. Notice that the remaining open seam is already in position to edge stitch down. It should just cover the seam line underneath, so that when you edge stitch that seam from the other side, it closes the cuff. Then top stitch the full cuff. You should find that your cuff joins the placket smoothly and is free of bulk at the ends. Collars have the same problem with bulk at the center front opening as cuffs do where they meet the placket, so I construct them in essentially the same way. Instead of attaching a collar to a stand and then the whole thing to the shirt's neckline, I attach the stand to the neckline first in very much the same way as I did a cuff, leaving the top edge open, to which I then attach a finished collar. This allows me to eliminate bulk here, which makes it a lot easier to make a buttonhole. It also makes it easy to center the collars around the center front. For each collar, you'll need a pattern for the stand. That's the part that attaches the collar to the shirt. And a pattern for the collar itself, which of course is the part that falls over the stand. I make my patterns out of cardboard so that I can use them over and over again. The stand pattern has built-in 1/4 inch seam allowances around all edges. But the collar pattern has no seam allowances because I use it to cut out both the inner facing and the outer fabric, and in my method they require different seam allowances. Here's a drawing that shows the seam allowances I use on both inner facing and outer fabric. For the inner facing, I add a 5/8 inch seam allowance only at the top edge. For the outer fabric, I add the same 5/8 inch seam allowance plus 1/4 inch along each of the outer edges. Because I want to use the same patterns for different neck sizes, I use only half patterns, which I place nearer or farther away from the fold of the fabric depending on the length that I want. I use a different center back marking for each size and position that on the fold. To figure out what length to cut the collar, you need to look at the neckline on the actual shirt. But before you measure it, you must make sure that it's been stay-stitched and clipped to the stay-stitching so that it will stretch out flat. Stay-stitching stabilizes an area that might stretch, keeping it from stretching. Because the neckline length is so critical, I stay-stitch it as soon as I've joined the fronts to the yoke. Then straighten the neckline out and measure it. Divide that measurement in half and transfer the measurement to the stand pattern, starting 1/4 inch from the end to allow for the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I mark the distance on the bottom of the stand pattern and create a temporary center back line. Then I bring the collar pattern down, and in this case my collar starts at the center front. In some cases they start back from the center front to create a gap at the center, but in this case there's no gap. So I'm going to transfer the marking from the stand pattern onto the collar pattern. Then I'm going to shift it 1/8 inch here to allow for the shaping that's going to go into the collar. You need the extra length because it gets taken up in the construction, as you'll see. If you're unsure of where you want to position the end of the collar in relation to the center front, put the stand on the shirt first, try it on, see where you want the collar to be, and mark it. To cut out the stand pattern, layer 2 pieces of fabric together so their patterns match, and fold them in half lengthwise. Then arrange the pattern so that the mark you made is flush with the fold. And since the seam allowances are built in to this, I'm just going to cut right around the edge of the pattern and then mark the centers. I've added a single layer of bleached cotton muslin to one of the stand pieces, so henceforth this will be the outer stand. I've glue basted the interfacing in place, transferred the center markings, and now I'm going to pin it to the back of the neckline. This is the outside of the shirt and the outer stand, pinning centers together. Working from the center out to each end, stitch the top collar stand to the shirt, stitching just inside the stay-stitching line. Now notice that I stopped stitching exactly at the end of the shirt and I didn't continue all the way out to the end of the stand, and that I'm leaving some thread tails behind, just as we did when we made the cuff. Pin the undercollar stand to the center back neckline on the other side and align the neckline seam allowance edges. With the unattached layer on the bottom, start sewing from the center out, exactly on top of the seam line you made in the previous step when you attached the top collar stand. Stitch about 1 or 2 inches, then stop with the needle down. Now go to the front edge of the stand where the ends of the 2 stand layers are and offset the bottom layer so that its front edge is about 1/8 of an inch longer than the upper layer. Doing this should form a small wrinkle on the upper layer. Hold the layers firmly with one hand and grab all layers behind the needle with the other hand. Then stretch slightly so that the wrinkle disappears. But make sure you don't bend the needle while you're doing this. Stitch to the end of the previous row of stitching while still stretching the layers. This will make the underlayer slightly smaller than the upper one, so it will curve better around the neck. Stop stitching exactly at the end of the previous seam line as marked by the thread tails you left unclipped. Then go back to the center back of the stand and work the other end the same way. To sew the ends of the stand, we have to roll the shirt fronts out of the way, starting right where the neckline seam ends, like this. But first, trace the shape you want for the ends onto the top layer from the pattern template. Use the mark on the pattern that shows where the collar stand should end to mark where you should stop stitching. Then stitch around the ends. Now you can trim away the corners and the seam allowances, especially along the neckline seam, where you can trim to about 1/16 of an inch. You may want to reinforce that section with a second row of short stitches on top of the seam. Turn the stand to the right side. Press the ends and compare them to confirm that they're identical. To cut out the two pieces that make up the collar, the top collar and the under collar, first fold the fabric lengthwise and line up the stripes. Then fold the fabric again, this time widthwise, and position the collar template. Set the Olfa cutter for a 5/8 inch seam for the top seam, then reset the cutter to 1/4 of an inch for cutting each of the other sides. After cutting the two collars, cut one of them 1/8 of an inch shorter on each end. This will be the under collar. I'm using 2 layers of bleached muslin for interfacing this collar. I've spray starched them so they stick together and are easier to handle. But you may want to look in my book for other interfacing options, including sources for professional all-cotton collar interfacing that you can use a single layer at a time. Fold them lengthwise and cut a single collar using 5/8 inch seam allowances on top but no seam allowances on the other sides. These other sides will become stitching guides when you assemble the collar. Position both layers of interfacing on the wrong side of the top collar, aligning the top edges. And sparingly glue baste the interfacing to the top collar at the front edge and for an inch or so at the points. Check the collar points to make sure the interfacing hits the same place on the stripes at each end. Position the top and under collars with the top collar on top and right sides together and with the centers aligned. To build in the curve around the neck, we need to stretch the shorter under collar to match the longer length of the top collar while we sew them together, just like we did with the stand. This creates the curve for the neck. To create this curve, start at the center back, then start sewing the two together, stitching along the interfacing for about 2 inches. Then stop, and with the needle down, align the collar point edges of the top and under collars. You'll see a buckle form when you do this. Now pull out the two edges together to stretch the under collar flat and sew to the front edge and stop. Turn the corner, stitching about halfway up the front, then stop again. Align the front edge of the top and under collars and now offset the top collar about 1/8 of an inch, creating a small buckle again. Then stretch the edges flat and sew off the edge. This builds in the curve for the roll of the collar over the stand. Next, trim the point seam allowances, and with the point presser, press the seams open. And with the point turner, turn the collar points. It's sometimes helpful at this point to unstick the glue basting near the collar points so the collar turns more smoothly. Iron with the under collar up and press the seam line just to the wrong side to get it out of view. To iron the curved top side, press it on a sleeve board or let it dangle off the end of the ironing board. To hold the layers in the position you've just ironed them, top stitch all around the edge. I prefer 1/4 inch top stitching, but choose any distance from the edge you like. Whatever it is, be consistent with it throughout the shirt. In other words, around the cuff and on the front bands if you've got them on your pattern. Top stitch from one end to the other, stretching lengthwise to flatten the curve. The next step is to build in the fold at the top of the collar. Start by first putting the collar points together and marking the fold lines at the top of the collar. If you don't have striped fabric, mark the fold with a pencil or something. Then carefully press the entire seam allowance to the underside from mark to mark. Now adjust the needle position on the machine as far to the left as possible. Position the seam allowance under the foot and stitch as close as possible to the fold line, holding the collar up with the left hand to keep the shape intact. This should position your machine basting about 1/8 of an inch from the fold. Finally, trim the seam allowances down to 1/4 of an inch and the collar is ready to attach to the stand. Okay, we're almost done. From here on out, I'm finishing this sample collar by making it a separate collar that's not attached to a shirt. I suggest you make your first collar this way. I've cut out and stitched together a sample stand, leaving the top edge open to attach the collar. Notice that I've also built shape into it and that I've clipped the seam allowance on the inside of the stand right to the top of the opening. But on the outside of the stand, I've folded the seam allowance under. So now let's arrange it as it will go around the neck. Here's the shaped collar, positioned around it in the direction that it will go. To attach them together, you slip the collar inside the stand, pick them up at the centers, and then match the ends. Okay, I'm going to pin it at the centers and go to the machine. Stitch the collar and stand together with a 1/4 inch seam, taking care to keep their edges aligned. The end of the collar matches the end of the opening, and I'm being careful to end my stitches exactly at the folded edge of the understand. Do the other side the same way. The ends of the collar should tuck neatly into the opening. The folded edges at each end should exactly cover the seam line we just made. Fold and press the rest of the opening so that it covers the seam line too. A little bit of glue baste will hold it precisely in position. Now we're ready to edge stitch all the way around the collar stand, which will close the opening in back. Start on the bottom edge of the stand a few inches away from one end. Stitch around the ends to the start of the collar, stitching as close as possible to the seam line where the collar starts. Then angle away from the seam line for a few stitches to make sure you're catching the loose edge underneath. At the other end, angle back up to stitch close to the end of the collar. And then edge stitch around the end of the stand. You can edge stitch completely around the bottom of the stand, but I prefer to quilt the center back to hold the layers of the stand together and add a decorative touch. If you want to quilt your stand, you need to have marked the stand before you start edge stitching. I divide the back of the stand into symmetrical sections so I can stitch a large W-shaped quilting pattern. On a real shirt, I'd start the ends of the W at the point where the front of the yoke hits the neckline. Now I'll zigzag from mark to mark to complete the quilting. When the whole thing is finished, the inside of the collar should be completely closed. Now it's time to give the collar its final shaping with the iron. Start at the inside stand at the center back and press the crease at the top of the collar. Then position the collar over the edge of a sleeve board so you can press it in sections to preserve the curve. And there it is. This is a soft sport shirt type of collar. If you want a more formal collar, you can add collar stays at the collar making stage. The method is described in my book. Stays will make the collar look more like this. So these are the techniques that turned my efforts at shirt making from a struggle to a pleasure. I hope you find them as useful as I have. If any of the techniques seem difficult, I'm sure you'll find that a review of the demonstration and making a few samples will clear up any confusion. I hope you've also seen that there are lots of different garment styles you can use these techniques on. Shirt details seem to crop up everywhere once you start looking for them, so keep your eyes peeled. If you come up with any interesting variations, or if you can think of any improvements on my techniques, please let me know. Thanks for watching.
If you've enjoyed shirt making techniques and its companion book, Shirtmaking, you'll find other great sewing titles in the Threads library, including books on quilting, knitting, and stitchery. Threads is the premier magazine for people who sew and love to work with fibers and fabrics. Open Threads to the world of the best techniques and creative ideas as you start your next textile or sewing project. You'll share in the tips, ideas, and resources of professionals and fellow enthusiasts. If you'd like more information about these products, write to the Taunton Press, 63 South Main Street, Post Office Box 5506, Newtown, Connecticut, 06470 5506.